Welcome, travelers of the stars, to a tale of strategy, deception, and unexpected heroism. In this galaxy, nothing is ever as it seems, and every decision could be the one that changes the course of destiny. Join Leo Carter, a conman turned reluctant commander, as he navigates the treacherous waters of galactic war, facing powerful enemies, shifting alliances, and the constant weight of a life built on lies. Will he rise to the challenge or be swallowed by the chaos of the universe? Stay with us as we embark on this thrilling journey. The echoes of urgent footsteps rang through the dimly lit corridors of Kiran Station. Leo Carter's heart pounded in his chest as the heavy thud of boots behind him grew louder. The air was thick with the smell of rust and oil, a far cry from the pristine spaceports of the elite. But none of that mattered right now. In his arms, he clutched a strange artifact, shiny but clearly fake, worth nothing more than scrap metal. Yet, to the merciless Nebula Raiders hunting him down, it was worth everything. They wanted their payment, and they didn't care who they had to chase down to get it. "You're not getting away this time, Carter," a gravelly voice shouted from the shadows. The words were enough to fuel his adrenaline, but the sting of betrayal was sharper. The artifact, now his only ticket to escape, had placed him in a deadly game he never meant to play. Leo rounded the corner and slammed his palm against the control panel of a nearby hatch. The hiss of air signaled the door sliding shut just as a few heavy footsteps reached the corner. He leaned back against the wall, his chest heaving, sweat trickling down his forehead. "Think you can escape forever, huh? You're just making it worse for yourself," the voice taunted again. But Leo grinned, knowing this was his moment. The hatch clicked. A deep breath. The engine of his ship, the Star Wanderer, was still alive, barely. A rumble shook the ship's hull as he jumped into the cockpit. He didn't have time for finesse, just brute force. He slammed the controls, praying to every god in the galaxy that he could get the damn thing off the ground. The ship lurched upward, the entire station seeming to shake as if it knew what was happening. Leo's heart sank. The Nebula Raiders had people stationed at every exit, and he was running on fumes. His escape was nothing but a prayer. "Computer, how long until total system failure?" Leo's voice was strained, but calm. It was just another problem to solve. "Approximately 10 minutes, the voice of his AI responded, monotonous as ever. "Also, your port engine might explode before that. Would you like me to calculate the odds?" Leo didn't respond. He just pulled the controls back and pushed the Star Wanderer into hyperspace. The coordinates were random. His escape was based purely on luck, or more likely, it was the kind of bad luck that would follow him wherever he went. The stars stretched into lines, the ship jumping into the unknown. The moment his stomach settled, Leo's eyes snapped open as his ship was jolted out of the warp, bursting into real space, and directly in front of a massive space station. A station so grand it made the rest of the galaxy seem like dust in the wind. It hung in space like a dazzling crystal flower, glowing with purple spires that spiraled up toward the heavens. Hundreds of ships circled it with graceful precision, bearing the unmistakable insignia of the Solaria Empire. Leo's blood went cold. This wasn't just any spaceport. He jumped straight into the heart of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. "Computer, get us out of here," Leo barked, panic creeping into his voice. But the response was as calm as ever. "Jump drive offline. Also, we're being hailed." A feminine voice crackled over the comm, laced with authority. "Unidentified vessel, you have entered restricted diplomatic space. Prepare for scanning and identification." Leo's hand hovered over the military badge that hung around his neck, the one his old friend had given him. A lucky charm, or so he thought. Now it felt more like a death sentence. With trembling hands, he brought the badge closer, feeling the heat of the purple light reflecting off the Solarian station. He could only pray it wouldn't be the last thing he ever touched. "Commander Raynor Carter, our deepest apologies." The voice suddenly switched, warmer now, respectful. "Welcome to ASTRO Station. Please proceed to Docking Bay Alpha 1 for your reception." Leo blinked in disbelief. His eyes darted to the badge again. He was impersonating a legend, someone far out of his league. The questions flooded his mind. What had he gotten himself into? Could he somehow get out of this unscathed? But it was too late. The massive doors of the docking bay opened, and as the ship drifted forward, Leo's mind raced with the realization that he had just flown into the heart of an empire. As Leo's ship, the Star Wanderer, slid into the docking bay of ASTRO Station, his pulse didn't settle. He could barely focus as his mind swirled with questions and confusion. Was he really about to impersonate Commander Raynor Carter, the legendary military strategist of the Solaria Empire? The entire situation felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The ship's landing gear made a loud, grating noise as it touched down, causing Leo to flinch. He cursed under his breath. This was it. He was in too deep now. The airlock hissed open, and Leo braced himself. The moment he stepped onto the pristine crystal floors of the station, an honor guard awaited him, their sharp purple-tinted uniforms gleaming in the ambient light. At their head was the most striking woman Leo had ever laid eyes on. She stood tall, with flawless purple skin that seemed to shimmer under the light. Her deep violet eyes studied him with a sharp, almost intimidating gaze, yet there was something oddly welcoming about her presence. She was undeniably military, radiating authority in every movement. Leo's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any officer. This was someone important. Commander Raynor Carter, she greeted, her voice smooth like silk, yet commanding. Welcome to ASTRO Station. I am Lieutenant Lyra, and I've been assigned to guide you through your arrival. Leo struggled to hide his shock. His mind raced. Commander Raynor Carter? He was supposed to be a military genius, not a deadbeat smuggler from the far reaches of space. Thank you, Lieutenant, Leo managed to say, forcing the words out, though his voice was less confident than he intended. He tried his best to mirror the salute he had seen in movies, his hand rising just above his brow, the practiced motion feeling foreign on his arm. Lyra's gaze softened for a split second, as if amused by his clumsy formality, before she nodded sharply. You've had quite the journey, Commander. Allow me to escort you to your quarters. The Emperor is expecting you for the evening's diplomatic function. Leo forced a smile, his mind a mess of nerves and panic. The Emperor? What had he gotten himself into? But he followed Lyra, trying to steady his breath as they walked down the sleek, curved hallways of ASTRO Station. The station's architecture was like nothing he had ever seen. Everything was made of some kind of reflective crystalline material that shimmered in the light, shifting colors with every step they took. Leo found himself almost mesmerized by the beauty of the place, his mind briefly distracted from the situation. I must say, Commander, Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. Your reputation precedes you. The stories about your tactical genius have spread throughout the fleet. It's an honor to finally meet the man who turned the tides at Centaur Prime. Leo chuckled nervously, though he had no idea what she was talking about. Ah, yes, Centaur Prime. I remember it well. Or, well, I would if I wasn't so exhausted. He winced at how forced the joke sounded. Lyra didn't seem to mind, though. You've earned your rest, Commander. The reception will be quite the affair. The Emperor himself will be there, and your insights will be invaluable. She gave him a sideways glance, a hint of amusement in her eyes. Though I suspect you'll have other matters to attend to once you've settled in. Leo felt his heart skip a beat. Other matters? He asked, trying to keep his tone casual. The Emperor has been waiting for you, she said with a hint of playfulness in her voice. The two of you were close once, were you not? It's been a long time since you last worked together. I believe he has many questions. Close? Leo's mind raced as they walked. The more he heard, the deeper he sank into this web of lies. He had no idea who this Emperor Zane was, and the idea of working with someone like Lyra's calm, sharp demeanor was enough to make him wonder if he was in way over his head. He wasn't a military strategist. He was just a con artist playing the role of a legend. They reached a set of polished double doors, and Lyra stopped. Your quarters, Commander. Take a moment to freshen up. The Emperor will expect you shortly. As Leo stepped inside, he couldn't help but gape at the luxurious suite before him. Everything was perfect, sleek, elegant, with a view of the nebula outside that made him feel small, insignificant. He slumped into the plush chair by the window, his mind spinning. The door clicked open again. Leo didn't look up, thinking it was another servant, but when the voice spoke, his blood ran cold. Commander Carter, I trust your accommodations are to your liking? Leo's head snapped up, his eyes meeting the sharp gaze of none other than Emperor Zane. The man's appearance was regal, but age had taken its toll. His silvery purple skin shimmered with the wisdom of countless years, though his eyes appeared clouded. Yet, there was an undeniable power in his presence that made Leo feel like a child playing dress-up. "Ah, yes, your majesty," Leo stammered, standing up instinctively, but not knowing quite what to do next. He hadn't been prepared for this. The emperor's lips curled into a slight smile. "I can see you've done well. I look forward to your insights during tonight's diplomatic function. I trust we'll reminisce about old times. It's been too long." Leo barely managed to mask his confusion. Old times? What was he talking about? Before Leo could respond, Emperor Zane turned and gestured for him to follow. "Come, let's not keep the others waiting. We have much to discuss." Leo followed Emperor Zane through the glittering halls of ASTRO Station, his every step weighed down by a rising sense of dread. The Emperor's presence was imposing, even with his apparent frailty. As they walked, a mix of ornate crystal chandeliers and gleaming walls reflected off the polished floor, creating an ethereal glow that made Leo feel like he was walking through a dream or a nightmare. The grandeur of the station only made him feel smaller and more out of place. He kept his head down, trying to avoid meeting the Emperor's eyes, but the old man's voice echoed through the silence. "So, Commander, I hear your tactical genius has made quite an impact. Tell me, how does a mere smuggler, if I may call you that, find the nerve to impersonate a legend?" Emperor Zane's voice was both amused and probing. Leo stiffened, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. His heart skipped a beat. Smuggler? The last thing he needed was the Emperor catching on to his charade. "Ah, well, your majesty," Leo began, his mind racing to come up with something convincing. "Sometimes, a change of scenery leads to new opportunities. I had to adopt a more strategic approach to survival. You know that old adage, fake it till you make it?" The Emperor gave a low chuckle, though Leo couldn't tell whether it was genuine or mocking. "Indeed. It seems your methods have worked so far, Commander." Leo gave a half smile, feeling the weight of the title settle uncomfortably on his shoulders. How much longer could he keep this up? The diplomatic function that awaited him seemed like an insurmountable mountain. He had no idea what was expected of him, no idea how to act, how to speak, how to be someone he wasn't. As they entered a grand hall, the buzz of voices reached Leo's ears. The room was massive, a sweeping space filled with hundreds of dignitaries, politicians, and military officers from across the galaxy. The air was thick with the scent of fine food and perfume, and everything seemed to shimmer. Metals, crystals, even the food on display, all reflecting the station's light. The atmosphere was extravagant, and yet there was an underlying tension that Leo could feel in his bones. These people were powerful, and every single one of them was watching him, waiting for him to speak, act, to be the legendary commander. Emperor Zane led him through the crowd with people stepping aside to make way. Leo barely had time to take in the faces around him before a sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. "Commander Carter, it's an honor to finally meet you." A tall, statuesque woman appeared before them, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was dressed in military regalia, her dark purple skin catching the light in a way that almost made her seem like a living sculpture. Her presence was commanding, her posture perfect, but there was something in her gaze, a suspicion, a challenge that made Leo uneasy. "Lieutenant Lyra," the Emperor said, his tone warm yet distant. "I believe you've already met the commander. I trust everything is in order?" Lyra's gaze flicked between the Emperor and Leo, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course, your majesty. Commander Carter's reputation precedes him." Leo nodded, hoping he was playing the part well. He tried his best to maintain composure, but he couldn't help feeling like Lyra was sizing him up, peeling back layers to expose the truth. He had no idea how much longer he could keep up this act. "Commander, I hope your trip was comfortable. I'm sure you've heard of the situation we face with the Nebula Raiders." Lyra's voice was low, almost conspiratorial, but there was no mistaking the way she watched him. It wasn't a friendly conversation. It was an interrogation. The mention of the Nebula Raiders sent a jolt through Leo's chest. This was exactly what he was hoping to avoid, dealing with the galactic warlord's problems while pretending to be someone he wasn't. He had no military experience, just a lifetime of cons, tricks, and the occasional bar brawl. "Ah, yes," Leo said quickly, his words stumbling out. The Raiders, of course. Very unpredictable, aren't they? But we can anticipate their next moves if we think strategically. If I may say, the key is to. He paused, his mind desperately scrambling for something that sounded remotely intelligent. Counter their movements with a feigned vulnerability. Lure them into thinking they have the upper hand, then strike when they least expect it. Lyra raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but Leo wasn't sure if she bought it. She was too sharp, too experienced. In this room full of politicos, she was the one person who could see through him, if she wanted to. And it seemed like she did. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted, deep and commanding. Commander Carter. The new voice belonged to a tall man in an elaborate military uniform, his purple skin darker than most others, with a glint of arrogance in his eyes. He gave Leo a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. I trust you've been briefed on our current situation. I hear your expertise in combat strategies will be most useful. Leo turned to face him, trying to steady himself. The man's presence was suffocating, his authority almost palpable. This was another test, another opportunity for Leo to falter. I've read up on the situation, Leo said, trying to keep his voice steady. But I think the key is understanding their motivations. The Raiders aren't just after resources. They want to destabilize us. They want to challenge our authority. It's not just about fighting them. It's about showing them that we can take their best shots and still stand strong. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Leo thought he might have pushed too far. But then, a slight smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Interesting, the man said slowly. I look forward to seeing what you can do with your unique approach, Commander. Leo's heart pounded. Every word he said felt like a trap, but he couldn't back out now. He had to keep moving forward, keep the con alive, because the moment it fell apart, so would he. The evening dragged on, with Leo finding himself swept from one conversation to the next. He tried his best to remember the military protocols and strategies that the Emperor had apparently expected of him. But every word he spoke, every gesture he made, felt like he was walking a razor's edge. One misstep, and the illusion would crumble. And all the while, Lyra's eyes never left him. She was watching him closely, too closely for his comfort. At one point, as the conversation shifted to more technical matters, Lyra leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. Tell me, Commander, how did you really end up here? Her words sent a chill through Leo's spine, her tone soft yet filled with an undercurrent of suspicion. Leo's mind raced for an answer. What was she asking? What did she suspect? He couldn't afford to slip up now. I told you, he replied with a forced laugh. Sometimes fate has a funny way of putting you in the right place at the right time. Lyra's gaze lingered for a moment longer than was comfortable. She wasn't buying his charm, but she didn't press the issue further. Instead, she gave him a small, knowing smile. Of course, fate. And here I thought you were just a man of strategy. Leo returned the smile weakly, though the weight of her words hung heavily in the air between them. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the night stretched on, Leo realized he was caught in a game far bigger than he ever intended to play. Leo stood near the grand window of the banquet hall, trying to catch his breath. The delicate glow of ASTRO station stretched out before him, casting a radiant purple hue over everything in sight. The lavish affair was unlike any gathering he had ever attended. Hundreds of alien dignitaries, military officers, and politicians from across the galaxy mingled around him, dressed in opulent robes and crystal-encrusted uniforms. The sight of such wealth and power almost made Leo feel like an imposter. But as much as he tried to focus on the grandiose beauty of the scene, his mind kept spiraling back to the conversation he had just had with Lyra and the Emperor. Lyra's words still echoed in his mind. Tell me, Commander, how did you really end up here? The insinuation was subtle, but the challenge in her voice was clear. It was as if she could see through him. The thought of it sent a cold shiver down his spine. He knew he had to be careful. If she saw through his charade, if anyone else found out he wasn't who he claimed to be, his life here would be over, along with the comfortable, deceit-filled existence he had carved out for himself. The sound of soft laughter drew Leo's attention away from his thoughts. Turning, he saw that a group of high-ranking Solarian officers had gathered, with Emperor Zane in the center, holding court like the grand figure he was. The Emperor had always been a man of legend, a figure whose reputation stretched across the galaxy. But Leo couldn't help but notice how frail he seemed now, despite the brilliant air of authority still emanating from him. Lyra was standing at his side, her sharp gaze sweeping over the crowd with the precision of a predator. As their eyes met, Leo felt something shift. The tension between them had only grown since their first conversation. It was like a game, one that he didn't know the rules to, but was being forced to play nonetheless. The last thing he wanted was to reveal his true identity. Yet, in every moment, Lyra seemed to be watching him, her eyes keen, calculating, as if she were waiting for him to slip up. Before he could gather his thoughts, the soft chime of his communicator buzzed in his ear. Leo quickly stepped aside, pressing the earpiece into place. "Commander Carter," came the familiar voice of his AI. "You're being summoned to the Strategic Command Center. The Emperor has requested your input on the current pirate situation." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Pirates? This was a conversation he'd been dreading. His lack of military expertise would only become more apparent in such a high-stakes situation. Still, he couldn't refuse. The Emperor had specifically requested him. There was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and made his way toward the door, trying his best to walk with the confidence of a seasoned military commander. But every step felt heavier than the last. He felt like a fraud. As Leo entered the Strategic Command Center, the room grew eerily silent. Holographic star maps flickered to life before him, marking out the positions of enemy pirate fleets along the outer rim of Solaria's territory. The room was filled with military officers, their cold, calculating gazes fixed on the map. The tension in the air was thick. Everyone knew what was at stake. If they didn't act quickly, the pirate threat could escalate beyond control. But Leo had no idea how to help. "Commander Carter," a gruff voice called out from the group, "we've been briefed on your unorthodox methods of strategy. The Emperor himself spoke highly of your unconventional tactics. We'd like to hear your input." Leo felt the weight of their eyes on him. It was a pressure he wasn't used to. He could see the skepticism in their faces, doubt lingering in their eyes. Who was he really? A smuggler? A fraud? Yet there was a part of him that knew this was his moment to either sink or swim. He could either bluff his way through or risk exposing himself. "Of course," Leo said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "We need to think about this situation from a different angle. The pirates aren't just an external threat. They're also a distraction, a symptom of something deeper, something more destabilizing." The officers exchanged curious glances. Leo took that as his cue to continue. "They're challenging us. But it's not about just defeating them. It's about what we represent to them." Leo paused, allowing his words to sink in. "We need to make them believe that fighting us is futile. If we show them we're strong, united, and unpredictable, they'll begin to question their own motivations." The officers leaned forward, intrigued by his words. But Leo wasn't done yet. He continued with a plan that he didn't know would work, but which he hoped would at least buy him some time. "We set a trap," he said confidently, although his mind was racing to figure out the details. "We make the pirates believe that we're vulnerable, allow them to take a few strategic points. But once they think they've won, we launch a counterattack, taking back those positions with overwhelming force. We catch them in the act, and their own arrogance will be their downfall." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the officers exchanged thoughtful looks, while others seemed skeptical. But one of them, a younger officer with a sharp gaze, stepped forward. "That could work," the officer said, his tone respectful but still skeptical. "But what about their larger fleets? We don't have the numbers to match them in a direct confrontation." Leo smiled slightly, the edge of his plan falling into place. "That's where our deception comes in. We make it look like we're reinforcing key positions, when in reality, we'll be pulling our forces back, allowing them to think they're winning. Once they're too deep in, we surround them. It's not about brute force, it's about making them play our game." The room fell silent as the officers absorbed his words. Then finally, the older officer who had first spoken gave a slow nod. "It's unorthodox," he said, his voice thick with intrigue. "But it might just work." Leo felt a rush of adrenaline flood through him. This was it. He had just convinced them to go with his plan, all on the strength of his confidence. They may not know that his entire strategy was built on half-baked ideas pulled from games of strategy he had played in the dim light of dive bars. But it was working. The plan had a chance to succeed. As the meeting wrapped up and the officers began to implement his strategy, Leo couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had just taken the first real step into this new identity, and somehow, against all odds, he had pulled it off. But his mind couldn't rest. Lyra's eyes kept flashing in his thoughts. She was still watching him, still waiting for him to slip. He had bought himself some time, but time was a luxury he didn't know how much of he had left. The following day was a blur of activity, and Leo barely had time to breathe. The plan he had devised, though risky, was set into motion, and now the tension was unbearable. He was in the middle of something far beyond his control, surrounded by the elite officers of the Solaria Empire, each one watching him with a level of intensity that made every word he spoke feel like a calculated move in a high-stakes game of chess. Leo sat at a table in one of the station's command rooms, staring at the holographic map in front of him. His fingers drummed nervously on the tabletop, his mind racing through the plan. It was a gamble, no doubt. If the pirates didn't fall for the ruse, if they discovered their position too early, it could mean disaster, not just for Leo, but for the entire station. The pressure weighed heavily on his shoulders. The door to the room slid open, and Leo looked up to see Lyra entering, her sharp gaze immediately locking onto him. She moved with military precision, her expression unreadable. Leo's heart skipped a beat. She had been on his mind since the night before, and every moment spent under her scrutiny felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. "Commander Carter," she said coolly, her voice as sharp as ever, "I trust you've considered the consequences of your plan. A misstep could cost us everything." Leo swallowed, trying to keep his composure. "I've considered everything, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "But if we don't act decisively, the pirates will only grow bolder. We need to show them we're not afraid. That's the only way to get them to back off." Lyra studied him for a moment, her violet eyes searching his face. For a moment, Leo thought she might see through his facade, but then her lips twitched upward into a faint smile. "You're a daring one, aren't you?" she remarked, her tone softer now. "But I suppose that's why the Emperor holds you in such high regard." Leo felt a sudden pang of unease. She was too perceptive. She knew something was off, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. But before he could respond, Lyra turned, her demeanor shifting back to that cold, authoritative air. "You'll want to make sure you're prepared. The Emperor has requested your presence at the war room. It seems the situation is evolving faster than we anticipated." Leo nodded, trying to mask the growing anxiety in his chest. His heart hammered in his throat as he followed Lyra down the sleek corridors of ASTRO Station. He couldn't help but feel like every step he took was leading him closer to an unavoidable confrontation. The Emperor's request was not something to be taken lightly. Something was happening, and Leo feared he was about to be caught in the crossfire. The war room was a large, imposing space, its walls lined with holographic displays showing the real-time movements of pirate fleets. The atmosphere was tense. Officers huddled around the central table, speaking in hushed tones, their voices laced with urgency. At the far end of the room, Emperor Zane stood, gazing at the maps with a calm, calculated expression. As Leo entered, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, Lyra, the officers, and even the Emperor. It was as if everyone was waiting for him to make the next move, to confirm whether the plan would succeed or fail. The weight of the room pressed down on him. "Commander Carter," Emperor Zane said, his voice deep and commanding, though there was a weariness to it now. "It seems your strategy has led us to a crucial moment, but we've received disturbing intelligence. The pirates have allied themselves with a more dangerous force, something we hadn't anticipated. This changes everything." Leo's stomach dropped. A new force? His mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. He had barely managed to keep up with the pirates, and now there was a new enemy in play? This was the last thing he needed. Lyra stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with authority. The pirates have linked up with a rogue faction known as the Crimson Hand. They've been expanding their influence on the Outer Rim, and their tactics are far more brutal than anything we've seen before. If we don't act quickly, the balance of power in this sector could shift entirely. Leo felt a chill run down his spine. The Crimson Hand. He had heard whispers of them, an underground faction of mercenaries and warlords who had been destabilizing systems across the galaxy. Their reputation for ruthless violence was legendary. If they had joined forces with the pirates, it meant trouble, serious trouble. "We can't afford any more mistakes," Lyra continued, her gaze never leaving Leo's face. "Your plan was bold, but we need to adapt. The Crimson Hand will not play by the same rules." Leo's mind raced. He was being thrust into a war that was far beyond his understanding, let alone his ability to lead. He didn't have the luxury of military training or experience, but he couldn't let that show. Not now. Not in front of these people who were looking to him for answers. "What if we turn their strength against them?" Leo asked, his voice low, but with a hint of urgency. "If we make them believe they're unstoppable, we can use that arrogance to our advantage. The Crimson Hand will be overconfident, and that will give us the edge." Lyra narrowed her eyes. "You're suggesting we manipulate them? Let them think they have the upper hand?" Leo nodded. "Exactly. If we show weakness in one area, they'll push hard. But when they go too far, we'll strike. The pirate fleets, the Crimson Hand, they all think they can control the galaxy by brute force. We need to turn that perception into their downfall." There was a long silence as the officers exchanged glances. Leo held his breath, hoping his gamble would pay off. Then, to his surprise, Emperor Zane spoke, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I think you may be onto something, Commander, but this strategy will require everything we have. We can't afford to fail." Leo nodded, his resolve solidifying. This was it, the moment of truth. He had no choice but to go all in. As the officers began to prepare the new plan, Leo felt a sense of urgency building inside him. Lyra's eyes still lingered on him, and he could sense the unspoken challenge between them. She was watching him, waiting for him to falter. But Leo knew he couldn't afford to. As the plan was set in motion, Leo found himself once again in the eye of a storm. The battle ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than ever. The fate of the entire sector rested on his shoulders, and deep down, he knew that if he failed, it wouldn't just be the pirates who came for him. It would be the entire Solaria Empire. The tension in the war room was unbearable. Leo stood at the center of a complex strategy board, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. The latest intelligence had been devastating. The pirates had not only allied with the Crimson Hand, but they had also gathered a fleet far larger and more organized than anyone had anticipated. What was once a tactical deception to lure the pirates into a false sense of security had now become a high-stakes gamble. There was no time to second guess. This was no longer about bluffing. It was about survival. "Commander Carter," Emperor Zane's voice echoed through the room, cutting through the noise. Leo turned to face him, the old man's clouded eyes sharp despite his age. "You were right to act quickly, but I fear we're reaching the edge of the cliff. The Crimson Hand are unpredictable, ruthless. They won't hesitate to destroy everything in their path if we don't stop them now." Leo nodded. He had never faced anything like this before, and yet here he was, steering the wheel of a ship he barely understood, heading straight into a storm. But he couldn't back down now, not when so many lives depended on the success of this mission. "We need to show them we're not afraid," Leo said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We need them to think they have the upper hand, to believe that they can crush us. That's when we strike. We will force them into a position where their overconfidence is their downfall." Lyra, standing to the side, crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. Her gaze never left Leo, her sharp eyes studying his every move, as if looking for any signs of hesitation. She didn't believe him. He could feel it. The suspicion in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "And if they don't fall for it?" Lyra asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "What if they catch on to your deception too early?" Leo met her gaze, refusing to back down. "Then we adapt. We shift the balance. We make them believe they've won and force them into a position where they can't escape. We have the upper hand in the long game." The officers around the table murmured, exchanging wary glances. The plan was risky, but Leo's conviction was undeniable. Despite the doubt swirling in the room, they knew they had no other choice. The Crimson Hand was a dangerous force, and without a drastic move, they would overrun the sector. "You have your orders," Emperor Zane said, his voice low but powerful. "We proceed with your plan, Commander. Do not fail us." Leo bowed his head respectfully, masking the anxiety that twisted in his gut. The weight of the Emperor's words pressed down on him like 1,000 tons, but there was no time for self-doubt. He was in this now. There was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur of intense coordination. Leo worked with the officers to refine the plan, overseeing every detail, ensuring that each fleet was positioned in exactly the right place. Every move had to be precise. One slip, one misstep, and the pirates and their new allies would tear through them like paper. The day of the operation arrived far too quickly. Leo found himself standing on the command deck of a warship, staring at the stars through the viewport. He could feel the hum of the ship beneath his feet, the low buzz of the engines, and the sharp tang of tension in the air. The Crimson Hand fleet was approaching, massive, dark, and powerful, ready to make their move. Leo took a deep breath, his mind shifting into a tactical mindset. This was it. The game he had been forced into was about to reach its climax. "Commander Carter," Lyra's voice cut through the stillness. Leo turned to see her standing by the tactical display, her eyes scanning the data. "Are you sure about this? The pirates are closing in on our position. We don't have much time left." "I know," Leo replied, his voice calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. "But we've worked too hard to back out now. Trust me, Lyra, this will work. Just keep them moving." Lyra hesitated, her gaze locking with his. For a brief moment, it felt like she could see right through him, right through the layers of deception and uncertainty. But then she nodded, her expression hardening into the mask of a military officer. "Fine, we'll follow your lead," she said, her voice cold but unwavering. "Let's make this count." Leo turned back to the viewport, his eyes narrowing as the pirate fleet loomed closer. His hands gripped the railing in front of him, and for a fleeting second, he wondered how much longer he could keep this charade going. He wasn't a legendary commander. He wasn't anything close to what the Solaria Empire thought him to be. He was just a conman who had gotten too far into a game he didn't understand. But as the countdown to engagement began, Leo pushed those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to be anything but Commander Carter now. The battle began with the sudden intensity of a supernova. The pirate fleet surged forward, confident in their overwhelming numbers, while the Crimson Hand coordinated their strikes with ruthless precision. Leo's plan was unfolding exactly as he had hoped. The pirates had taken the bait, pushing forward to seize key positions, believing they had already won. The trap was set. But just as Leo had predicted, their arrogance was their undoing. As the pirates pushed deeper into the system, they grew complacent, unaware that they had already been surrounded by hidden Solarian forces. The trap had closed. The Crimson Hand had committed fully to the attack, only to find themselves surrounded and cut off. "Now!" Leo barked into the comm, his voice crackling through the intercoms of the fleet. "Move in. We strike now." The chaos that ensued was unlike anything Leo had ever witnessed. Ships engaged in intense dogfights, beams of energy lighting up the dark void of space as Solarian fighters tore through the pirates' ranks. The pirates' overconfidence quickly turned to panic as the Solarian forces closed in, their planned retreat cut off by the surrounding fleet. The Crimson Hand, too, found themselves caught in the crossfire. It was the opening Leo needed. He watched as the pirates and their allies scrambled, their plans crumbling in the face of superior tactics. The fleet was in disarray, their organized attacks turning into desperate attempts to escape. "Victory is within our grasp," Leo murmured under his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline surging as he realized they were winning. They had done it. Hours later, Leo stood at the center of the war room, watching as the last of the pirate ships were mopped up by Solarian forces. The victory was theirs. The Crimson Hand had been driven back, their alliance with the pirates shattered. It had been a close call, but in the end, Leo's strategy had worked. The pirates had underestimated their enemy, and that had been their downfall. Emperor Zane approached Leo, his expression unreadable but filled with an almost imperceptible glimmer of respect. "Commander Carter," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I must admit, I didn't think your plan would work, but you've earned your place among us. You've earned the title of a true commander." Leo's chest swelled with pride, though a part of him still felt like he was living in someone else's skin. But for now, he allowed himself the briefest moment of triumph. As he turned to face Lyra, her eyes met his. For the first time, her gaze softened, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You did well," she said simply, her voice low but sincere. Leo nodded back, his heart still racing from the battle. "We did well." In that moment, Leo realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where his skills, however unorthodox, had a purpose. The deception was still there, still lurking in the shadows, but it no longer felt like the weight of a lie. For the first time, Leo wondered if in a way, he had finally found a new identity. And in that identity, maybe there was more than just survival. There was victory, there was redemption, and perhaps there was even a future. The war room was still, the hum of the command center's machinery the only sound that filled the space. Leo stood at the window, gazing out at the stars that twinkled silently in the vastness of space. The fleet had won. The Crimson Hand had been repelled, the Pirate Alliance shattered. But even as the glory of the victory washed over him, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. No, the universe was too vast, too full of hidden dangers, and the game he had just played? It was far from over. Behind him, the soft sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet room. He turned to see Lyra entering, her expression unreadable. She didn't look like the same officer who had scrutinized him at every turn. There was something different in her eyes now, perhaps respect or perhaps curiosity. Or maybe it was just the silence that had settled between them since the battle had ended. "Commander Carter," she said, her voice calm but somehow warmer than it had ever been. "You did it. You saved us all. The Crimson Hand will think twice before making another move against the Solaria Empire." Leo nodded, but the weight of the victory didn't fully settle in him. "We did it," he corrected, his voice almost wistful. "But we can't stop here, can we? The pirates are beaten, but there are still countless threats out there. More alliances, more factions, more enemies. It's just the beginning." Lyra studied him for a moment. Her eyes narrowed with a mixture of thoughtfulness and something else, perhaps a hint of understanding. "You're right," she said softly. "This war, it's only one chapter in a much bigger story. But for now, we've made a statement, and that's something." Leo turned back to the viewport, watching as the last of the wreckage from the battle drifted into the void, the debris scattering into the endless expanse of space. He had won, but part of him knew that in a universe like this, peace was always fleeting. He could already feel the stirrings of the next challenge on the horizon, something darker, more insidious. It was only a matter of time before something or someone else came knocking. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime from his communicator. A familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "Commander Carter," the voice of Emperor Zane filled the room, firm and authoritative. "I trust you're aware of the new developments in the Outer Rim. We have reports of increasing pirate activity and unusual movements from the Crimson Hand remnants. You've proven yourself capable of extraordinary strategies, and I'm calling on you once again. There's work to be done, Commander. Work that only someone like you can handle." Leo's chest tightened at the Emperor's words. It was the call to action he had been expecting, the one that would force him into the heart of yet another conflict. The universe was wide and full of chaos. Nothing ever stayed quiet for long. Lyra, noticing the shift in his expression, stepped closer. "I guess there's always more work to be done," she said, her voice soft but filled with a knowing resolve. "But you've earned your place here, Carter. Whatever comes next, you won't be facing it alone." Leo's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was a smile tinged with the realization of just how far he had come and how much farther he still had to go. "Thanks, Lyra. But it's not just about facing things together. It's about choosing how we play the game next. And trust me, the universe doesn't care how many battles we win. It'll keep throwing curveballs at us." The communicator beeped again, a final warning. Leo could feel the pull of duty, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. But the war, this part of the journey, was only a moment. He knew the real challenge was in the unknown, in the twists and turns that lay ahead. "Well then, I guess it's time for the next chapter," Leo said, turning to face Lyra with a look of quiet determination. "Let's see what comes our way." The camera pulled away from the vast window of the command center, drifting out into the cosmos, where the stars continued their silent watch over a universe filled with endless possibilities. There, on the edge of known space, the Solaria Empire had won a battle, but the true game had only just begun. In the distance, a new threat stirred. A dark, uncharted world, an unknown force was watching. And Leo Carter, commander, conman, and now reluctant hero, was unknowingly stepping closer to a new chapter in the galaxy's endless dance of power, deception, and destiny.